Greetings and welcome. We are in Junior English and we now are turning in your hymnal to page 614, 615, 616 and following. Your textbook struggles to try to understand how to introduce you to a time period that is sometimes referred to, like on 616, Westward Expansion. I would write that term down at level 1. Westward Expansion. And sometimes we will refer to this as manifest destiny. Manifest destiny. Now this is a difficult topic for us to talk about, especially because we live in the American West. We live in Wyoming. We are reminded regularly by names on side of highways, by indigenous peoples, native peoples who continue to live out here, that there is a history that is going to be an unsettling one in regards to American thought and American action. One way to say this is there's kind of like maybe two really difficult moments in American history that you have to accept, you have to embrace, and you have to move beyond. One of them, obviously, we've already spoken of, is the slavery question. How is it possible that over 200 years men have been buying and selling other men before we finally get around to the American Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation? The second, and obviously by extension, will be the whole question of civil rights moving forward into the 1960s and the great Martin Luther King Jr., right? The second has to do with this question of the treatment of native peoples. Let's go ahead and write it down as that. The treatment of native peoples. When you study America and American history, you have to come to terms with the question, what about the people who were already living here? What about the people who were indigenous, native to this place we call America, which is why often they will be referred to as Native Americans. Inappropriately, of course, they're often referred to as Indians. Of course, this is an irony of all ironies, because when these people are discovered, many of the explorers thought that they were looking for another passage to India, the actual India itself. And so these native peoples were called Indians, ironically, because the assumption was they had arrived in India. Of course, nothing could be farther, both literally and geographically, from the truth. Right. And yet, the name kind of has stuck. All the way down to today, where, for example, we are engaged even today in a debate about how can you qualify, for example, the names Indians to be applied to native peoples. How does it work in, for example, sport logos and the like? To what degree do these native peoples deserve a certain modicum of respect by virtue of being native peoples to this culture, to this country, right, to America? We're going to turn now and talk for a few minutes about the problem of Westward Expansionism, and then we're going to look at two passages. We're going to look at one called Heading West, Miriam, Davis, Colt, and it's just a journal of the movement going west. We'll introduce you to it here in a moment. And then finally, we're going to hear maybe some of the saddest words you'll ever read by Chief Joseph. Of course, Chief Joseph is an important figure as we start to think about our own Wyoming experience. Some of you are maybe familiar with the Chief Joseph Highway that runs outside of Cody and goes over the top of the mountain on its way over to Red Lodge in Montana. That maybe you knew was named the Chief Joseph Highway, but you didn't understand who this Chief Joseph individual was. We've got to talk about him here in a few minutes as well. But first, let's start with this notion of manifest destiny. It is sometimes problematic to explain or to understand that many early Americans were thoroughly convinced that their coming to this new place called America was for them a mission from God. So you want to write this down. They spoke about the experience of coming to America in very religious language. God had, for example, created a city on a hill there was going to be a new kind of world created, and that new world would be created in large part around religious and Christian principles. So it only makes sense that early on, large numbers of people translated the idea of the movement west in religious terms, ergo the phrase manifest destiny. Let's take the term and break it down. First of all, destiny. The idea of inevitability is buried in the term itself. In other words, this must be. It is fated. It is fated that the lands west of the Mississippi would become part of America. Manifest. God made it so. The problem of movement west is multi-layered. Some of it has to do, of course, with just population expansion. More people living in the cities, so now increasingly more Americans are starting to think about heading out west. Number two, not only is it an issue of population, it's an issue of economics. That is to say, people want their own land, they want to make their own money. One easy way to do that is to come out west. So, you begin to have that movement west. Number three, huge, the railroad. The railroad. As the train and the steam engine merge, and you have the railroad construction happening, you have larger numbers of people coming out west. That will happen from New York and Boston through Chicago to Kansas City and then west. Of course, one of the major stopping points, Denver, Colorado. Denver becomes one of the hubs as we move west. Of course, if you've driven at all from Nebraska heading west, you know that very quickly you hit that range of mountains called the Rocky Mountains. You're familiar, of course, with this because we live in the Bighorns, which is a part of that northern part of the chain, right? Which runs all the way up into Canada. Question, how do you get a train over those mountains? On the other side of the mountains, of course, the desert, and then, of course, the coast. That's California, right? So you start to have this movement west on the trains, and then finally the last thing is you have the expectation of gold. Mining. Not only gold, but also silver. And that brings large numbers of people on the hopes that they can mine for gold. And there's these stories that start to happen that, hey, you can make millions and millions of dollars. It's lying all over the ground. Huge chunks of gold lying everywhere. And if you're living in Boston or New York, you go, let's do it. We'll head out west. That'll be fine. The only problem? Well, there's two. First of all, it's distance. People who have lived in New York and Boston all their life have absolutely no idea about distance. They got no clue. This still happens. I have pals, for example, who land in Denver and they tell me, don't worry, I don't need a flight into Worland, I'll drive. And I say, you're going to drive from Denver to Worland? And they say, yeah, it's no problem. I'll rent a car. I'll be up. I always get the phone call around Shoshone. And they will say to me, oh, where do you live? Is this like on the moon or something? I just drove from Casper to Shoshone and there's nothing out there. It's all totally rock. Like, how much further do I have to go? And I say, well, that all depends on, where you want to head to. But yeah, there's a lot more of that nothing but space. You guys live in this area and you're accustomed to it. The geography of space, no way. People did not have a clue what they were doing when they got in their little buggies at Kansas City and said, we're headed to Denver. Now, today if you drive on the interstate from Kansas City to Denver, you're spending a number of hours. Would you agree with me? And that land that you drive through in Kansas and Nebraska, depending on time of year, but that land you drive through is predominantly grain and cornfields. Grown up, right, out of Iowa into Nebraska, lots of corn, lots of grain, right? In other words, it's all farmland. It wasn't farmland. It wasn't farmland in the early 1800s. It's nothing more than grassland completely covered by wildlife, especially buffalo. and native peoples who live on these plains. Now let's talk about these native peoples for a moment in your notes at level 1. When we talk about these plains Indians, we are talking about peoples that are predominantly migratory. This is crucial you write this down and understand this. I've had juniors that say, I guess I never really understood this. They are hunter-gatherers. They do not grow crops primarily. They don't, for example, put seed in the ground. They travel predominantly on foot or horseback, and they hunt to live. Primarily, they hunt buffalo. There are stories that blow the mind during this time period. One story comes from some explorers who are out west who swear the ground is moving. In fact, they say they thought that the Lord, they are Christians, that the Lord was returning and it was Judgment Day. The ground is moving. There's a huge storm cloud, dust coming their way. They quickly run out of their tents up onto a little hill, and then they realize that what's coming at them is a herd of buffalo. They stand up there on the hill to wait for this herd of buffalo to get past them, and the ground doesn't stop moving for 7 days. D-A-Y-S, days. 1 week, that herd of buffalo continued to move past them. Millions and millions of these buffalo. Today, of course, we can see a few of them inside of a small enclosure in the town 30 miles away in Thermopolis, and that's what we call a group of buffalo. There was a time when the buffalo herds of the Middle West, of the plains, are prodigious beyond imagination, and these native people, they will follow these herds of buffalo. It's their primary way of survival. Okay? They are not agrarian. They don't plant seed. With westward expansion, then, something tragic will happen that we want to write down in our notes. A migratory people start to become forced agrarian, sedentary. The movement is explained on page 616, where you will see it in the second to the last paragraph, the cycle. The cycle was always the same. I hope you're reading it with me on 616. Are you reading it with me? Second to the last paragraph. Though the settlers often lived harrowing lives, the most endangered people on the western frontier were the American Indians, native peoples. As the frontier advanced past the Mississippi, tribe after tribe was driven from its ancient homeland. I hope you're reading this with me. This is a significant moment in American history. The cycle, are you reading it with me, was always the same. As white settlers encroached upon new lands, the tribes in that region would resist and fight. It would be not unlike somebody showing up at your house tonight and saying, yo, you're out your house, we live here now. Your instincts would be, oh, I beg your pardon, but no, that is not the way it works. They, the settlers, brought with them firearms that native peoples did not possess in the early years, especially once what we call the repeating rifle happened. That is to say, you didn't have to load that muzzle over and over again with buckshot or with a bullet, but rather you had a repeating rifle where you could put bullets in and they would shoot over and over again. Native peoples did not have this form of technology at all. They could easily be attacked and exterminated if they decided to put up a fight. Keep reading. United States soldiers would be sent to secure the area, and war would ensue. We think of General Custer, don't we, right? Eventually, the Indians would be defeated. They would either be forced onto a reservation or made to sign a treaty in which they were promised food or money in exchange for their lands. More often than not, these promises went unfulfilled. And a classic line from Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, the famous line is, the white men made lots of promises, they only kept one of them. They promised they would take our land, and they did it. One of the famous and disturbing lines from Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, a title that you might want to list at 3A as one obvious title of study if you're interested in this topic. This was the cycle. But wait a minute. You need to write that word reservations down, because that word is a significant word. What does it mean? Literally, it means the following: land reserved for native peoples. That's what it means. That's what the term reservation means. Lands reserved or set aside, especially for native peoples. Two observations about this. One, very regularly, not always, but very regularly, the land set aside or reserved was not good land. It was kind of crummy land. In other words, the Westward Expansionists and the soldiers would look at the land and say, what's the best land? That's where we're going to live. What's kind of the crummiest land? That's where we're going to put these people. And we're going to force them to live there. But more significantly, I hope you heard what I said, these are migratory people. They define their lives by movement. They move with the seasons. They move with the herds. They move. Their whole lives are defined by movement. They are migratory people, and now they are forced to become sedentary people. They are forced to become agrarian. I hope you're writing that down. And I hope that you are not sophomoric enough to just roll your eyes and say, big deal. This is a huge moment in the history of America. You are talking about literally tens of hundreds of thousands of people who live out on the American plains who move. They move. They move with the herds. They move with the weather. They move with the seasons. They move. And now all of a sudden they're being told, no more movement. No more movement. You will become a farmer. That's what we're going to do. Like I said, when you travel from Kansas City west through Nebraska, through Kansas, down I-80, the interstate that runs right across all this country, it's all farmland now. And these settlers said, if we're going to plant, you will plant. Sure enough, they made these people who were migratory peoples, who defined themselves by movement, to become sedentary, to learn how to become farmers. Well, all kinds of problems ensue, not least of which, large numbers of these native peoples, because they don't understand sedentary, they're migratory peoples, they begin to resort to alcohol. This will be a huge moment. They begin to resort to drugs and alcohol as a way to somehow balance the fact that they are stuck in a place they do not want to be. There is, I think, a lot that has to be said for cultural misunderstandings here. Western expansionist thinkers thought they were doing the native peoples a favor by helping them to settle down, to become sedentary. Westward expansion, and of course the white man is the phrase that's always used here. Westward expansion can easily be simply seen as white people doing nasty things. This is a very silly and sophomoric way to talk about this very complex situation. But one of the byproducts of reservation life is that native peoples had to come to terms with the fact they couldn't get up and leave when they wanted. With that ended, many of them, their culture, the language, the stories, the religious understandings of the relationship between the land and the peoples. For example, if you are a people that all your life you have been told you have to travel to special sacred lands to bury your honored dead, and then all of a sudden at gunpoint you're told you can't go to that place anymore. That place is no longer for you. That land is for other people, not you. But you don't understand. I have to go to that land. That's where all my ancestors are buried. I have to go to that land. No, you're not allowed to go to that land anymore. You can appreciate, I think, that there is a certain kind of desperation that begins to set in as a culture is going away. Not just linguistically, not just with one's language, but with one's spirit. Something is being lost that will never Underline the word never. Never return. Never return. When the last of certain native speakers die, for example, and they haven't taught the language to anyone else, or when the last of a certain tribe is exterminated with bullets or disease or famine, no one ever will speak that language again. See, we are talking about tribes of people who spoke different languages. They were not a monolith. They were not all the same. They spoke different languages. They had different understandings and different cultures within tribes, even sometimes dialects. And lots of those languages gone, never to come back again. There is something which must be said about that. There needs to be at least a marking of that fact, that the passing of those cultures is a sad, sad moment in American history, American thought. Now, what was on the flip side? You're sitting here. You're sitting on land that once was understood to be land you couldn't buy. The very first native peoples here said this to these early Western. You can't buy land. How can you own land? The land is a gift from the Great Spirit. You don't buy it. You live on it for a while, and then you move off of it. You want to buy it? Yeah, and then we're going to fence it. And then we're going to call it our own. Native peoples didn't understand this at all. It was so counterintuitive to the way they saw the world. And of course, Westward Expansion began to bring the numbers of population, so that of course we had the rise of the cities, didn't we? In the state you live in, for example, your largest city remains, of course, Cheyenne. It was right there north of Denver, and that train brought people up, and of course brought cattle, and then sheep, and of course then you start to have the kind